This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with a series of episodes that each dive into one of the 12 core classes in the new Player's Handbook, starting with Fighter. Before moving on, if you want to hear weekly discussions of TTRPG design and philosophy, check out the Untitled TTRPG podcast I do with Rel over on his YouTube channel and on Spotify. And if you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. So there are a few reasons that I wanted to start with Fighter when it comes to practical possibilities. First, I wanted to start with the 4 traditional classes that make up an archetypal D&D adventuring party. And second, it's one of the classes that's had the biggest playstyle changes in this new version. To me, the new fighter design exemplifies an important game design lesson, that games are ecosystems, and that sometimes the best way to address some kind of issue is to add energy to something else. In Tai Chi, this is referred to as the string of pearls. Each joint of the body is connected to another, and if one part is misperforming, we actually adjust the surrounding joints to bring the misperforming part into alignment. Funnily enough, game designer Jesse Schell uses the exact same string of pearls analogy in his textbook, The Art of Game Design. In the fighter's case, I would argue that, from a mechanical standpoint, the 2014 version suffered from a lack of class identity. While it had some unique class features like Second Wind and Action Surge, it lacked a core distinct gameplay style that players could easily point to and say, yup, that's the fighter's thing. Looking at some of the weapon-using peers, barbarians have rage, monks have martial arts, paladins have divine smite, and rogues have sneak attack. Looking at the first few levels of fighter, we got a fighting style, which isn't fighter unique, Second Wind, which isn't as impactful as something like rage or divine smite, and Action Surge, which can only be used at most once per encounter until high levels. While the other weapons users had features that defined their playstyles, by comparison, the fighter base class feels awfully generic. So what's the fix? Using the string of pearls method, the answer is to add a whole new subsystem to weapons, in this case, weapon mastery, which assigns each weapon an additional property that can only be unlocked through a special feature. And fighters have become the so-called masters of weapon mastery. Weapon mastery not only makes each weapon feel more distinct and makes selecting your weapons feel more meaningful, but it also helps close the gap between weapon-using characters and spellcasters. Barbarians, paladins, rangers, and rogues also unlock weapon mastery, but because they have narrower playstyles, they're also more limited on which weapons make sense for their character builds. Fighters, on the other hand, eventually get a 9th level feature that allows them to potentially have up to 4 of these masteries available at all times, which no other class gets. Now, before I move on further, I do want to circle back and just say that fighters, while lacking class identity in 2014, weren't necessarily the weakest of the martial classes. After all, they did have an important distinct feature, an ability score improvement at level 6. This meant that they could maybe pick up an extra feat or max out their ability score progression faster than any other class. And in 2014, there were definitely some feats that were quote-unquote must-haves for specific builds, like Great Weapon Master, Polearm Master, Crossbow Expert, and Sharpshooter, to name a few. While this was a powerful feature that only fighters got, from my experience with new players, it isn't immediately obvious why it's so powerful. Even for me personally, it took a few years and some immersion into the character optimization community to understand why this extra ASI at level 6 was so powerful, and why Fighter was a great base class by extension. Now, thankfully for 2024, the feats, which is another subsystem that affects fighters, have been rebalanced against each other. So I no longer see feats as being must-haves or terrible trash feats for the most part. And also, Fighter's distinct features, many of which were added for 2024, are now a lot more obvious. So now on to the big question. Is Fighter the right class for your next character? To answer, let's look at it through a number of different lenses. First is class complexity. When evaluating a class's complexity, I usually ask myself 3 questions. How many choices does a player have to make to create a character? How many choices does a player have to make at the table in the moment? And how much is a player expected to remember? The 2024 Player's Handbook lists Fighter as a low complexity class, but when I go to answer these 3 questions, personally I feel it's more medium complexity. Unlike other weapon users, the Fighter toolkit is broad enough to create any kind of weapon-using character. After all, that's why they're named fighters. They're just characters that are generically good at fighting. The class can be used to build a sword and shield character, a dual wielder, a great weapon user, polearm user, an archer, or a gish, which is someone who uses both weapons and spells. Other classes can choose between some of these, but not all of them. So, for example, barbarians are highly incentivized to create strength melee builds, and the specifics of rage prohibit the use of concentration and spellcasting. Therefore, barbarians can really only be built for great weapons, polearms and dual wielding, and sword and board. And even then, some of these options are going to work better than others. Rogues, on the other hand, require a ranged or finesse weapon to trigger sneak attack. So I find they're even more limited when it comes to weapon selection. When it comes to creating a fighter, there are various fighting styles that support these different weapon configurations, but the obvious combinations aren't the only viable ones. For example, when creating a great weapon fighter, so a fighter that uses a big two-handed weapon like a great axe or a great sword, it might be intuitive for new players to select great weapon fighting. But defense, which is an AC bump, or blind fighting, which grants blind sight, are also great options that work well with it. Now, if you add on weapon masteries, even at level 1, there are a lot of different choices that a fighter player has to make. However, that's all in the build of the fighter. When it comes to actual turn-by-turn decision-making, things aren't as complicated, at least at low levels. At levels 1 and 2, all fighters really have to worry about is targeting, attacking, and making sure that their positioning isn't too vulnerable. When it's needed, they can pop Second Wind or Action Surge, but otherwise they have a very predictable gameplay loop. Level 3 adds a layer of complication because that's when fighters get their subclass, which adds a whole bunch of tools to their toolbox. Since this is an analysis of D&D 2024, I'm going to make a broad assumption that your table is only using the core classes from the new Player's Handbook. Otherwise, this would be an impossibly long episode if I tried to consider every legacy subclass and option from the past 10 years. However, even within just this new Player's Handbook, every fighter subclass besides champion requires a decent amount of resource management, which now adds a layer of complexity in terms of turn-by-turn or in-the-moment choices a player actually has to make at the table. And even then, with champion, there are just a lot of other bullet points that need to be remembered. Now, I don't think any of these particular choices are overwhelming, but compared to some other character classes, I just don't see fighter being a quote-unquote low complexity class. I will say, to the credit of whoever designed the fighter, that the pace of new information that the class asks you to learn each level is pretty smooth. It doesn't dump too much new information at once, but by level 5, most players will have to consider their fighting style, weapon masteries, resource management for Second Wind, Action Surge, or subclasses, remembering the details of the feat that they're likely to pick up at 4th level, and remember that they have extra attack. Again, there are definitely easier or more direct builds, but it's also far from as complex as some classes can get. Which brings us to the fighter's role. Now, no matter how you build, your fighter is most likely going to be spending their action to attack and hit stuff. However, from a cursory look at the other classes and subclasses, I also wouldn't be surprised if another martial party member outdamages you at least before 11th level. Fighter does get some nice damage boosts through its subclasses or potentially through feats, but looking at the reliability of features like Rage, Flurry of Blows, Divine Smite, and Sneak Attack, I'm not entirely convinced that Fighter is always going to be the best damage dealer. There'll for sure be a spike at 11th level when they get their 3rd extra attack, but most campaigns notoriously end around 10th level. Although I think fighters will be good damage dealers, really I think their key distinguishing trait is that they make pretty good secondary controllers from their weapon masteries. Yes, again, other classes get weapon masteries. Fighters just get more of them and have a breadth of options that other classes' playstyles are more limited to. If you combine that with Action Surge, fighters may end up hitting targets 3 or 4 times in a round, imposing effects over and over again. And their subclasses will offer some additional benefits to this role. But in short, going into it, I would assume that 2024 fighters are going to be a kind of hybrid damage dealer / controller, leaning toward one of these roles based on a particular build. For example, if you're building a dual-wielding fighter with the Nick property, they're going to be better damage dealers, whereas if you're taking a fighter with Topple or Push, they're probably going to be better controllers. Now, to complement what they're strong at, I also think it's good to discuss weaknesses. Like most martial characters, fighters lack consistent area of effect options. Overall, I think area of effect is situational and won't come up every game, but do know that if a fighter gets swarmed, there is a good possibility that the swarming weaker enemies might just out-action economy them, just like many DMs have suffered from having a big solo boss monster just get surrounded and shoved into the dirt. Fighters by themselves also don't have a reliable bonus action, which, depending on your preferences, may make them feel unsatisfying to play. For example, there have been many times where I've had players feel like their character isn't doing as much because they watch a fellow monk flurry of blows for 4 attacks, or rogues do a big sneak attack with their action and then use cunning action to bonus action dash or disengage hide. Even though mathematically the fighters were doing as much or more damage than those other characters, it still didn't feel like they took a quote-unquote complete turn because they didn't use a bonus action too. Now, it does mean that there's room for fighters to multi-class some levels of other classes to pick up these low-level bonus actions, which we'll get to in a bit. First, I do want to cover the 4 subclasses we see in 2024, starting with the Champion. Now, in 2014, Champion was notorious for being one of the most mechanically weak subclass options. Not to mention the fact that it was just kind of boring. At 3rd level, it had improved critical, meaning you could crit on a 19 or 20, and anyone that's looked at damage spreadsheets will know that crits don't really add a significant boost to damage. And you can go entire sessions without getting a 19 or 20, meaning you're not seeing your character perform their signature feature. At 7th level, it used to also give you a small bump to strength, dexterity, and constitution checks and improve your character's jump distance. And at 10th, you'd get an additional fighting style, which usually meant you were taking defense and getting a +1 AC boost. From my experience seeing champion fighters at the table, for the most part, players tended to be unsatisfied with them, and they would feel like a worse barbarian that lacked damage resistances and would get hit more often. Now in 2024, though, champions still get their improved critical at 3rd level, but they also get remarkable athlete reworked and moved from level 7 down to level 3. It now grants advantage on initiative and athletics checks, and after you score a critical hit, your fighter can move up to half their speed without provoking opportunity attacks. The bonus fighting style gets moved down from 10th to 7th. I think this is a big deal because we just have more fighting style options now. So let's assume, say, that you're creating an archery fighter. So you have the archery fighting style at first level. While it used to be that defense was really the only secondary fighting style that made sense for most builds, now we have things like blind fighting or thrown weapon fighting if you're playing a melee character. There's just more options now, so that additional fighting style feels a little more meaningful. Champions also get heroic inspiration, which, as I've discussed in previous episodes, is now way better than what inspiration used to be. Overall, champion is still a relatively simple, direct subclass, but with the low-level advantage on initiative checks and having advantage on all athletics checks without needing to rage, I do think it distinguishes itself from Barbarian a little more. So next up is the Eldritch Knight. From my experience with new players, I don't think spells by themselves create complicated characters. It's choosing which spells to take and which to use in the moment that add stress and frustration. Now, in 2014, assuming one was playing with just the player's handbook, Eldritch Knight was definitely one of the weaker subclasses. They didn't have the same power as a full caster, and they were sacrificing their weapon-using potential by substituting their extra attack by using an action to cast a spell. Like how Weapon Mastery was a pearl on the string that solidified the fighter's class identity, some shifts in 2024's spell design also really helped the Eldritch Knight. For example, the jump spell is now a non-concentration bonus action that grants a significant movement boost, meaning an Eldritch Knight could cast this spell and still have their action free to make weapon attacks. The other significant boost comes with War Magic at level 7, which now lets an Eldritch Knight replace one of their attacks with a cantrip. This feature here fulfills the core fantasy I think a lot of Eldritch Knight players were looking for. It not only opens up the Eldritch Knight to have access to more damage types with spells like Firebolt or Ray of Frost. There are some tactical options like using Shocking Grasp to shut down opportunity attacks, or just potentially a straight damage boost for their normal weapon attacks with the redesigned True Strike. Prior to 2024, I never thought I'd see True Strike listed on any character I'd build, much less for a Gish build, but here we are. While I think spellcasting can be overwhelming or complicated for full casters, I think that compared to the other two fighter subclasses we'll get to next, the spell selection of Eldritch Knight is a little more obvious to really synergize with the fighter's core gameplay style. Now, in terms of complexity, next, I'd say that the Psy Warrior is a little more complicated than the Eldritch Knight, but a little less complex than the Battle Master. Whereas spell slots are a resource type used by many different classes and subclasses, the Psy Warrior energy dice, as a separate resource to track, can take a little while to learn. Protective Field is a great way to also dip into the support role in addition to damage and control. And Psionic Strike gives a neat little damage boost with a fairly reliable damage type. I think the reason I feel that Psy Warrior is more complex than Eldritch Knight is that a new player can start to pick up and learn about the intricacies of spellcasting by watching how their spellcasting party members learn how to use their spells, while Psy Warrior has unique resources that require a more specific sense of timing to use. And finally, I feel the most complex subclass is the Battle Master. It also has a unique resource in the form of superiority dice, and while its resource management is similar to Psy Warrior in that you have a separate pool of dice that you can use at certain times, that you get to add to certain things, the real increase in complication comes from selecting from the menu of maneuvers. At third level, Psy Warrior has 3 options: Protective Field, Psionic Strike, and Telekinetic Movement. However, Battle Master maneuvers take up 2 full pages. So not only do you have to decide from a build perspective which maneuvers make sense to take, you also have the added complication turn by turn. Is now a good time to use my superiority die? Which of my maneuvers is going to make the most sense? Now, originally, I was a little nervous that weapon masteries would overlap too much with Battle Master. And while there are some that do similar things, like topple and trip attack, the difference is Battle Master maneuvers work with any attack, which also includes spells and unarmed strikes. So you could pair trip attack, say, with a longbow, whereas you can't usually get topple on the longbow. There's all sort of strategic decision making you can do between Weapon Mastery and Battle Master. And personally, the maneuvers I'm drawn to are ones that are fairly unique to Battle Master, like disarming attack, menacing attack, and precision attack. As for multiclassing, I think fighter dips are as good as they've always been. Barbarians and rogues could both benefit from a 1-level dip for a fighting style, and any martial class could benefit from Action Surge. Now, thankfully, Action Surge has been nerfed a little bit. You can't use it for magic actions, so we won't be seeing any more caster shenanigans by picking up 2 levels of fighter to cast multiple big spells in a row. That all being said, I think I'd prefer to keep fighter as my base class and pick up levels around it. Depending on the build, a 1 or 2 level monk or rogue dip could be a huge asset, especially a 2-level dip grants a reliable bonus action alongside the 3 attacks at fighter 11, and a 1 or 2 level dip into barbarian for range and danger sense can go great with strength melee fighters. Overall, I recommend 2024 fighters for new players that want to play characters that are strategic weapon users. There's a bit of complexity over barbarians and rogues, but the features are also grounded as opposed to the magical feeling paladin or ranger. For new players, the subclasses I'd recommend would be champion or eldritch knight. However, my personal love is still with the battle master. Just know if you're going to pick it, you're going to have a lot to juggle between superiority dice, maneuvers, and weapon masteries, whereas champion and eldritch knight just feel a little more streamlined. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Fesliyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at fesliyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.